yesterday.
Okay.
Oh, the DVD.
Welcome, welcome. We held it just till you got here.
That's right.
Suzanne is not aware of the Zoom test.
Okay.
And the internet just went down and thumbs up.
Okay.
Well,
So we will-
that would be it.
we will
They
soldier
couldn't-
on.
They couldn't do it anyway, so.
Oh, I'm so sorry that I do not have to share the spotlight
I was
with
about to
anyone
say,
else.
are you going to be able to fill the hour?
I don't know.
I don't think
I don't know if I have enough
so.
stories.
Can you handle this?
I don't know if I can. Thanks, guys, but it's really thrown me, and I'm going to have to bail out
I'm
now.
gonna go really stream of consciousness.
This has now become a Sam Irvin panel.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
Oh, there's a lot of that.
Can we put that in big Judy Garland lights,
That's
picture
right.
bulbs, and
Well, folks, we're gonna be real casual and laid back. Now, I know Sam is a creature of tradition, and I'm gonna break the rules, and it's probably gonna upset, I'm just kidding. We're gonna be in your living room, talking, shooting bull.
yeah.
And
honestly-
we have a chance for you guys now to ask a lot of questions.
Yeah. I honestly haven't prepared a freaking thing. So it's good, ask
I'm an
questions.
old radio interviewer. I had a show for 30 years on air and interviewed a lot of people, and I was getting ready to, do some prep for Sam, but I knew you're not really a creature of habit, and I had too much coffee this morning, and I couldn't keep my hands straight to make notes. So I said, screw it, let's just talk. So anyway, he's got a couple of films that I really, really like. A couple of things that I will ask you, just the ones I want to know, because I haven't asked you this whole weekend, so that I can save it for now.
Lovely.
This is Sam Irvin. He's the director. I'm sure you guys know Sam. I assume you guys know Sam from his work. And I want to ask you about one. Well, we actually did touch on this a little bit when I talked to you the other day at dinner or whatever. About, I think, one of the most earth-shattering films I ever saw growing up that you made with a gal that I got to know pretty well for a little while in the '90s, and that is Elvira's Haunted Hills. And how that all came about, because I think that's a really fun story.
Well, some of you may have already heard me tell this story this weekend, because I've already told it a couple times, so I'm sorry if I bore you, but the long version of this is that in 1961, I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and my dad owned movie theaters. And when my older sisters would babysit me, we would just go to the theaters and watch whatever movies were showing. And at the age of 5, I was taken to the first run theatrical release of Pit and the Pendulum. And it changed my life. I fell in love with Vincent Price, I fell in love with Roger Corman, I fell in love with horror movies, and I really, really loved the idea that there could be a giant blade on a pendulum that could slice a human in half. And a 5-year-old kid was like, what? It just, wow. And it gave me nightmares, but I didn't let on to my parents, and I was scared by it because I worried they wouldn't let me see a horror film again, and that's all I wanted to see from then on. I wanted to get right back on that roller coaster and be terrified. And it just was everything to me. And then flash forward to junior high school, the teacher assigned us to do a monologue, memorize a monologue and perform it in the class. And she was thinking Shakespeare or whatever, and I am allergic to iambic pentameter. So I suggested that, could I please do Edgar Allan Poe? And I figured that sounded academic, and she bought it. And said, okay. So I raced home, and this is in the 60s, long before home entertainment. People didn't own movies. But I had recorded the sound on reel-to-reel audio tapes. This is before cassettes, even.
Was it one of those little ones?
The little reel-to-reels,
Prized possession.
And, prop up the microphone with the speaker of the TV, and I recorded every horror film that came on, and I had Pit and the Pendulum recorded. So I went home and I transcribed Vincent Price's monologue from the climax, and went in the next day and performed that monologue and got an A. Now, it really wasn't Edgar Allan Poe, of course. It was the screenwriter, Richard Matheson's words, but I wasn't about to tell the teacher that. She might have known and just kind of looked the other way, but I don't know. I think she probably bought it. And so anyway, that was that. Then, about a year later, I was 14 in 1970. I found out that there was a production of Oliver that was going to be performed on stage right here in Atlanta, and the role of Fagin was going to be played by Vincent Price. So I went into my mother and held a gun to her head and said, "You are driving me the 4 hours to Atlanta to see this show because I have to meet Vincent Price." And so she did. Now, in the meantime, I did forget to tell you that at the age of 12, I started organizing kiddie matinees at my dad's theater on Saturday mornings. And I always showed horror films, and I would do retrospectives. And we did all of the Edgar Allan Poe Price movies. There were 8 of them, and we did it week after week. And I created a flyer with the calendar, cut out ads from the press books, and pasted it all up. And so when I went to Atlanta to see Vincent, I of course brought one of those flyers. And when I finally met him, I explained that my name was Sam Irvin, and he went, "Oh, you must be related to Senator Sam Irvin from North Carolina." I said, "Well, no, he spells it E-R-V-I-N, and it's I-R-V-A-N, but it's pronounced the same, and we always get the best tables at restaurants when we make reservations." And we just go along with it. We don't say anything. And he laughed, but it was memorable to him, the name. Then I show him the flyer, and I said I did this at 12 years old. And he was very impressed at how industrious I was as a kid, and impressed that, I loved his movies so much and to be doing these retrospectives. And then I said, "And by the way, I know your monologue from the end of the Pendulum." He says, "Oh, you do not." And I go, "Yeah, I do." "Do you know where you are, Bartolome? You are about to enter hell. Hell, the netherworld, the infernal region, the abode of the damned, a place of torment, Gehenna, Naraka, the pit, and the pendulum, the razor edge of destiny, thus the condition of man, bound on an island from which he can never nor hope to escape, surrounded by the waiting pit of hell, which must destroy him finally." And I did that, and all of the other fans in line clapped like you just did, and Vincent was gog, he couldn't believe it. And so I was the most memorable fan that day, I'm sure. So, and then a year later, when I was 15, still didn't have a driver's license, he was doing a lecture tour series and came to a college campus in Charlotte, North Carolina, or somewhere in North Carolina. And again, I went in with my trusty gun to my mother's head and said, "You are driving me to see Vincent Price." So she drove me there, and we got in line to see him again. But when he came out the stage door, he immediately spotted me and went, "Sam, what are you doing here?" And because my name was memorable. And he turned to the crowd and he said, "This young man knows my monologue from Hidden Pendulum." And he makes me do it for them like I'm a wind-up doll, or his little wind-up monkey. And so I did it, got applause, and we talked for a few minutes, and he couldn't have been nicer. And I was just so amazed that he remembered me and all that. So then when I was 17, I graduated from high school, and I bamboozled my parents into sending me to London, because by then I was editing and publishing a fanzine on horror films called Bizarre. And I wanted to interview all of my Hammer film idols like Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee and everyone. And so they sent me there, lo and behold, and I had already been corresponding with some of them. I'd actually interviewed Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing with questionnaires through the mail. So I had their addresses now, and so I wrote to them ahead of time and said, "I'm coming to England, I really want to meet you in person, and let's do a follow-up interview in person." And Christopher Lee wrote me back and said, here's my phone number, when you get to town, call me. So I call him, and he goes, well, I'm actually working. And I'm like, oh God, here's the excuse coming in. And he says, so would you mind coming out to Pinewood Studios and we'll have lunch? And I'm like, okay. So I didn't know like what he was working on, and he seemed kind of rushed on the phone. I didn't want to start interrogating him. There wasn't IMDb back then. There wasn't any, I had no idea. I was kind of hoping it was a Hammer film or a Dracula movie or whatever. But I get out there, bless you.
Thank you.
And find out that he is starring in The Man with the Golden Gun, the James Bond movie. And so we are having lunch in the commissary. He's been broken early for lunch because they're still shooting some other stuff without him. And so we're kind of alone in the commissary for about an hour, and I have my little tape recorder. Now it's cassette.
Now it's cassette.
Very modernized now. And then and we're just having this, he couldn't have been nicer and lovely to me. And, it felt like we were already friends because we had been corresponding. It was just so weird. But it was great. And then we're wrapping up, and we finished eating, and we've kind of finished the questions that I had. And the rest of the film company starts to trickle in because now they've broken for lunch. And in walks Roger Moore and Britt Eklund and Maud Adams and the director Guy Hamilton, who directed Goldfinger, which is my favorite Bond film, and little Hervé Villechaize, who played Christopher Lee's sidekick in that movie. You remember De Plane from Fantasy Island. And he's introducing me to all of these people, and I'm just like stars in my eyes. I can't even believe it. But I'm packing up my tape recorder and, figuring that I'm going to be dismissed any second. And Christopher says, so Sam, they'll be eating for an hour. Would you like me to give you a tour of the Bond sets? So, no, I'd rather go back to London. No, I was like, what? So he gives me a tour of the Bond sets for an hour, and then he ends up, the last set that he showed me was, his character was Scaramanga, and he shows me Scaramanga's lair. This beautiful living room and dining table and everything built inside these rocks that were supposed to look like, the exterior of it was actually shot on Phuket Island and I kid you not, it was Phucket. Somebody said, oh, that's pronounced Phuket, and I'm like, no, I like Phuket. I'm going with my pronunciation. So then the company finished lunch and they were trickling in, and Christopher, and again, I'm going to be dismissed, right? I'm going to be sent home. No, Christopher says, just stay right here. And he goes over and he's like huddling with the director, and the director's looking over at me with like suspicious eyes. And then Christopher comes back and says, I've spoken to the director and gotten permission for you to stay and watch the shooting the rest of the day. So I'm like, what? I'm as big a James Bond fan as I am a Hammer horror fan or anything else. This was just incredible. Now, I didn't get to see any shagging or car chases or anything, but they had this big scene at the dining table, and it was Roger Moore at one end and Christopher Lee at the other, and Britt Eklund in her bikini in the middle. And I thought it was hilarious that they had this long dialogue scene, and Britt Eklund didn't have one line of dialogue. She literally was there for eye candy.
Yeah.
And Hervé Villechaize was serving them in his little butler uniform. And it was the classic James Bond scene where, where Bond is like, well, you could have killed me when I landed on the beach. And he goes, yes, but that wouldn't have been as delicious. And he wanted to, draw this out and give you the opportunity to, turn the tables on me. It was basically that kind of, ridiculous dialogue. And, but it was really fun to watch them shoot it. So at the end of the day, Christopher says, do you want a ride back in the Rolls-Royce limo that the studio provides us to London? And I'm like, yeah, I'll share that ride with you. That's fun. And so I get in the back, and I didn't realize that he was also going to be sharing it with Hervé Villechaize. And Hervé you know, is like 3 feet tall, and Christopher is like 6'7", you know, and they're sitting in the back seat like this, and I'm in the little fold-down seat behind the chauffeur seat, facing them, and so I'm just this sort of captive audience, and I'm just wondering how this conversation is going to go all the way back to London. Well, Hervé was already 10 sheets to the wind, and he started to regale us with stories about, are we all adults in here? Can I be a little colorful? Okay. He was regaling us with stories about all the prostitutes that he'd hired since he'd been to London. And he was telling stories in graphic detail. And he was peppering his sentences. Now, he had a very heavy lisp. And almost every sentence, he would say the word pussy. And Christopher Lee would hear that word and he started to giggle, and then the next time he said it, he started to laugh, and the next time he said it, Christopher was doubling over in hysterics. And I was laughing, and Hervé obviously knew that was the trigger button to get us to lose it, and so every time we would compose ourselves, Hervé made sure to say pussy again. And we were just in hysterics the whole way back. And I remember when we dropped Christopher Lee off at 45 Cadogan Square. I'll never forget that address. And it was the same block where Boris Karloff had lived. He was no longer at that time, but they were actually neighbors and had worked together in Curse of the Crimson Altar and had done a TV episode of a British Karloff series where Karloff played an inspector, and I forget the name of the series, but it was a British thing in the 50s. But anyway, it was such a cool address, you know, for me. I was like, this is hallowed ground here. But I remember looking out the back window of the limo as we're driving away, and Christopher Lee was hanging on to the wrought iron fence, just going, trying to get it out of his system before he had to go inside to face his wife, Yeet, and have to explain what he's laughing about. Anyway, that was the last time that I saw Christopher, but it was just the most incredible day. Now, you would think, I mean, this is really the long version of this story, because it is going to circle back around.
I trust you.
You would think that would be enough for a fanboy for a day. Nope. I went back to the hotel and I decided that I was going to go see a play that was being performed on the West End of Pygmalion. And the role of Eliza Doolittle was being played by Diana Rigg.
Oh, God.
And I was a huge Diana Rigg fan, for Emma Peel from the Avengers, for her Bond film, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and she's my favorite Bond girl of all time, other than Martine Beswick. And I just but I really wanted to interview her because she played Vincent Price's daughter in Theater of Blood.
Yes.
So I went to try to get a ticket. The show was sold out. But as happens, there's usually somebody standing out front with a ticket from, you know, somebody got sick or whatever, and they're selling. So I snapped that up, and it was an incredible seat. It was like 7th row center. And I take my seat, waiting for the show to begin, and I hear this very familiar laugh behind me. I turn around, it's freaking Vincent Price. And before I can open my mouth, he says, "Sam, what are you doing here?" And I explain how I want to meet Diana Rigg and interview her for my magazine. And he goes, "Oh, well, you're coming backstage with me, and I'm going to introduce you to her. And by the way, let me introduce you to my new fiancée, Coral Brown, whom he had met and killed in Theater of Blood." She was one of the... Theater of Blood is about a Shakespearean actor who doesn't win the Critics' Award, and he goes and kills all the critics for not voting him. And she was one of the critics. And lo and behold, Diana Rigg was the one who had actually introduced them before the movie started. So they knew Diana intimately, and so they took me back and stage afterwards and introduced me to Diana, and Vincent goes, and Diana, this young man knows my monologue from Hitting the Pendulum. and he makes me do it for her. So then you think, okay, I have really, kind of milked as much as I can out of that damn monologue. You would be wrong. Flash forward to 1998, I guess. And this is after Vincent has passed away. And I get a call from Cassandra Peterson, who is Elvira, of course. And she saw my first film as a director called Guilty as Charged. It was a dark, comedic horror film with Rod Steiger playing a madman who kidnaps murderers and fries them on his own electric chair. And I'll tell another story about that if you remind me after this.
I will, yes, that was a great movie.
But she loved that film, and she wanted to consider me, to talk to me about possibly directing Elvira's Haunted Hills, and but they were interviewing other directors and whatnot. So I figured, I'm never going to get this, but okay, let's see what happens. So I sit down. She hands me the script, and she goes, "Now this is a spoof of the Vincent Price, Edgar Allan Poe, Roger Corman movies, like Pit and the Pendulum. Are you familiar with them?" Do you know where you are, Bartolome? You're about to enter hell. Hell, whatever. I go through the whole monologue, and the whole time I'm doing it, her head is slowly cocking to the side, and she's squinting her eyes like, this guy is nuts. And I'm thinking, she's going to be calling security in a minute. And when I finish the monologue, she just goes, "You're hired." And that's exactly how I got it. So from the age of 5, seeing Pit and the Pendulum till that moment, I mean, when I say that film paid off,
you milked it for all it was worth, that's for sure.
For sure. Now, while we're on the subject of Vincent Price, I did go on to a very, very close friendship with him, and I was developing a film that I was going to direct that he and Coral were going to star in. We worked on it for 2 or 3 years. It was scripted by Brian Clemens, who created the Avengers and wrote the Avengers TV series, and wrote and directed Captain Chronos Vampire Hunter, and he wrote the script for Golden Voyage of Sinbad, and he wrote the script to Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. He's
incredible writer.
Yeah, and idolized him. Anyway, that film never happened because we couldn't get the financing together. But in working on it, it was a way for me to become a much closer friend of Vincent and a colleague of Vincent, as opposed to just a super fan. And we became very close. And in my book, it's called "I Was a Teenage Monster Hunter: How I Met Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and More," I go into all of this in there, and I encourage you to read it. But I talk about my relationship with Vincent, and it did at one point almost become intimate. He would have liked it to have been. At that time, I was married to a woman before I came out, and I just didn't. We were still trying to get the film going, and I felt for professional reasons and everything, it would not be a good idea to go down that path, and so I kind of put the brakes on. But it was, it's my way of explaining that our relationship was very close, and it remained very close. And several years, and the oddest thing was how many times I would bump into him just by coincidence. It was, my parents were visiting me in New York. After I got out of college, I moved to New York to work as Brian De Palma's assistant. That's how I started in the business. And my parents came up to visit, and they stayed at a little boutique hotel called the Wyndham, and it was near the Plaza Hotel. And I went up to pick them up at their hotel room, And as we're coming down the elevator's doors open, and there's Vincent Price and Coral Brown. You step into the elevator, and Vincent goes, "Sam, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, these are my parents. And he goes, "I remember your mother. She brought you to see me, And so it was, and we said, "We're going over to the plaza, to the Oak Bar, to have drinks, and then we're going to have dinner. Would you like to join us, at least for drinks or whatever?" And they said, "Yes, that would be lovely." And so they came over with us, and we hung out at the Oak Bar. And then several years go by. I've divorced my wife. I met my now husband, Gary. We've been together 42 years, since 1982. And Gary and I go up to see Hope and Glory, the John Borman film that had just opened at the Coronet Theater. It was right, and we were early. We bought our tickets, and we went across the street to Bloomingdale's, and we're in the men's department, and there's Vincent Price. And I go over to him, and he turns around, "Sam, what are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm actually looking for Christopher Lee." And he says, "Well, you've come to the wrong place." And so I said, "We're actually just killing time because we're going to see Hope and Glory across the street." He says, "Oh my God, Coral and I just bought tickets, and we're killing time too, and we'll all sit together." So we watched the movie together, and it was just these weird things like that would happen. Well, when my first film came out, Guilty as Charged, the one with Rod Steiger, it was 1991, and it got a review by then I was living in Los Angeles, and it was reviewed in the Los Angeles Times by Kevin Thomas. It got a rave review, which I was so happy about because it's my first film, and you're just so worried it's going to be trash. And the reviewer said that Rod Steiger's performance was reminiscent of Vincent Price in Theater of Blood.
Wow.
Which was music to my ears beyond all reason. I mean, if you'd said in Pit the Pendulum, maybe that would have been even better. But anyway, so then about an hour later, the phone rings, and it's Vincent. I'm going to get choked up. But he had read the review, and he said, "Congratulations, I can't believe they compared it to me, and of all people, it just seems like it's some kind of serendipity." And I said, "Vincent, it's playing in Westwood. You're right near your home. Let me come and pick you up, and we can go, and I'll take you to see it." And he said, "I can't, because I'm bedridden now." And he was dying of cancer. And so heartbreaking. But we talked for a minute, and then I could tell he was weak, and I didn't want to keep him on the phone. But a few days later, I got a letter from him, and he always wrote me the most beautiful letters and the most beautiful handwriting. But I could tell this one, it looked like he had struggled a little bit. The lines were a little crooked, and some of the words were a little scratchy and hard to read. But he said, in essence, one of the phrases that I remember so distinctly is, "My God, we go back all the way to your childhood, and I'm so proud of how far you've come," and blah, blah, blah. And I wish I could go see the film. If I feel better, it's the first thing I'm going to do. And congratulations, and I hope you'll have many more and everything. And he said it was just so nice to hear your voice and to talk to you on the phone and all of that. And that was the last communication I had with him before he passed away. And that is in my book. I even have I reproduced the letter itself, but I also transcribed it in the text. And but yeah, he meant everything to me. And when we made and Cassandra Peterson also knew him very well. And when we made Elvira's Haunted Hills, it was absolutely a love letter to Vincent. We dedicated the film to him. The Vincent Price character in the movie is played by Richard O'Brien of Rocky Horror Picture Show. And for those who don't know, he played Riff Raff, but he also, a lot of people don't realize, he wrote Rocky Horror.
Oh, yeah.
The play, the screenplay of the movie, the music, the lyrics.
The sequel.
The sequel,
Yes.
shot treatment, yes,
Shot treatment.
everything. So, he's a brilliant guy, but he loved Vincent Price's stuff and knew it backwards and forward, knew exactly what we were spoofing. And we made sure that when he's outdoors by the lake walking with Elvira, we got those glasses from Tuna Blagia that have the little side flaps and the blinders or whatever, and we just everything about that movie was a tribute to the Corman movies. I always felt like this is the way that Mel Brooks made Young Frankenstein as a love letter to the Universal Frankenstein movies. This was our love letter to Vincent and Roger Corman. So, yeah, it all kind of weaves and ties together. But that's how I got the job to do Elvira's Haunted Hills, and it was the most heartfelt job of anything I've done. I've directed 55 films now, and that is the one that I always cite as the most meaningful in every possible way.
Well, a lot of monster kids like myself picked up on a lot of that stuff. I think it's what made that. And I didn't want to talk to you. I had a chance to meet Cassandra over a period of a few years when she was coming down here to do the haunted house here in Atlanta with Alice Cooper and the others. Out of all the Elvira films, I mean, that's the one that is the most heartfelt. I mean, you can feel it.
Yeah.
You can feel it.
Well, I also, I love the first Elvira film.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of
stuff.
hers over that anyway. But what I love about our film is it's not a direct sequel. It takes place in the 1800s in Transylvania. It has nothing to do with the first one.
Right.
And we never explain, how she got in a time warp or anything. But what I love about it is, she hosted horror movies, and I like the idea of taking the Elvira character and dropping her into a genre of horror. So this was our Edgar Allan Poe Vincent Price movie. I wanted to do one where we put her in a Frankenstein film, and we put her in a Godzilla movie, and we put her in a Queen from Outer Space movie, or but it just hasn't happened. And many other Elvira movies have tried and failed to get financing and whatnot, and I think the ship has kind of sailed now, and she's retired the character. At least she's retired getting dressed as Elvira, and I just don't think it's going to happen. I think her good friend Pee Wee Herman, Paul Rubens, they were the Groundlings together, and they shared the same co-writer, John Paragon, who was John B. the Genie in the Pee Wee's Playhouse, but he co-wrote all of Elvira's stuff and co-wrote all of Pee Wee's stuff. They're very close friends. When he got the deal with Netflix to do another Pee Wee movie a few years ago, they paid him $3 million, and the budget was $30 million. And I think, she heard that, and she was like, well, if they came to me with that, I might come out of retirement. But they've approached it, and it turns out that the Pee Wee movie was a disappointment, and it's just not going to happen. And unfortunately, she's kind of got it in her head now that her deal on the first Elvira movie was not very good, and she didn't make much money beyond the initial payment.
Yeah, no, she didn't make much of it.
And the second one, no one would do a second one, so she and her husband financed the set Elvira's Haunted Hills with their own money. They mortgaged their house, and they didn't get their money back, and they had to downsize and sell their house, and so she has a really bad taste in her mouth about the financing and the money. So she ain't doing a low-budget third Elvira. She's not going to scrape, people say, oh, you should do a Kickstarter campaign. And she's, yeah, right. No, if somebody's going to give me $3 million and we'll have a $30 million budget and we can do it luxuriously, that's the way she'll do it. And otherwise, I just don't think it's going to happen, unfortunately.
Where did you film Elvira's Haunted?
We shot it in Romania, and the locations were in Transylvania, and which is, you know, outside of Bucharest, and then the sets that we built were in a big studio in Bucharest, this big old studio that had been there, you know, for decades. And the interesting thing is she had already gone to Romania before I was hired to she has actually it was her husband's brother or cousin or some kind of relative of her husband. Grew up in Romania, knew a lot of the people in the Romanian film industry, and knew that there were lots of castles there. And so the two of them went over to tour castles and see what was available. And so when she hired me, she said, so we saw a bunch of castles and we're trying to narrow it down which one we want to do, but there's a lot of problems with each one. And I said, yeah, I know. I went over there and did the 2 Oblivion films that I did, the sci-fi westerns with George Takei and Julie Newmar and everybody. And on days off, we would all go tour castles, Castle Dracula, you know, different stuff. And there are 2 types of castles there. There's ones that are open to the public and museums with velvet ropes and everything is pristine and it doesn't look haunted, it looks too polished and everything is perfect with lots of antiques and stuff, and you're not going to be able to go in there with equipment and spider webs, or, you know, you can't change it up. And it would be very expensive to shut it down because they have so many tourists coming through. So those aren't going to work. And the other ones are derelict. They're abandoned, or, you know, leaky ceilings, no running water, no heat, rats, you know, homeless people, graffiti. I mean, it's just like, no, it's just not going to work. And I convinced Cassandra, I said, look, those early Edgar Allan Poe, Vincent Price movies, they weren't shot in castles. They were shot on sets in Hollywood. And when you saw the exterior of the castle, there were matte paintings. And I said, they always felt like grim fairy tales to me in a storybook. That artifice was what I loved about them. And that's what we need to do. And she said, well, then why are we going to Romania? And I said, well, I've shot in Romania, and the reason you go to Romania is because there's very cheap labor, and we know the people at the studios, and we can get a really good deal, and we can build amazing sets. So, so that's what we ended up doing. And I talked to the production designer who'd worked with me on the Oblivion films, and we sent him all the Edgar Allan Poe movies to look at and everything. And I said, now, when you look at the pendulum set, Roger Corman built, or, you know, his production designer, Daniel Haller, who was brilliant, they built the slab and a little bit of the pit, and then obviously the pendulum with the working stuff, and they built the wall up to a certain height. But in the really wide shots, they used matte paintings to extend out and do the ceiling and turn it into a much, much more cavernous dungeon. And so the Romanian production designer, Radu, said, oh, you know, we've got some old-timer, you know, matte painters that I'll get out of retirement, and we'll do it that way. And I'm like, yes, that'll be great. So then, and all this is happening long distance because we haven't gotten over there yet. And so when we finally get over there, Radu's, you know, I meet Radu at the studio, and he says, well, I have good news and bad news. What do you want to hear first? I said, well, go tell me the bad news. And he goes, well, all the matte painters have died. But come with me. And he takes me in and opens the door to this soundstage where he has built the entire Pit and the Pendulum dungeon from the bottom of the pit up to the ceiling, everything, this huge cavernous set that was as big as any James Bond set that I had seen at Pinewood Studios, with Hieronymus Bosch murals on the walls and all the gears that were perfectly duplicated, and I just cried. I was like, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And it was, again, it was just that childhood seminal moment of when I saw that movie and was just so like haunted and weirded out by the blade and the pendulum, and now I'm seeing it created just for us. it was a moment. But yeah, and then, we were able to just create these things from the ground up. I mean, the low budget movies I make here in America, we're not building sets, we don't have the money for it. We're just going out and renting somebody's home, and kind of using it as is, maybe adding a Christmas tree. It's like, so, to be able to really create everything in a fantasy world to specification was just unbelievable. And that's another reason why the film is so meaningful to me. So yeah, it was great from that respect. But then a few exterior sequences were done in Transylvania. We did have a scene where the coach pulls up to the castle. The wide shot of the castle was a model and partly painted, but it was just this little cheesy model that we had. But we needed for the gates where the horse and carriage come through and the front door, we kind of needed a real thing, which we could have built, but we found this church up in Transylvania that had the perfect gate and all of that. So we did use that as a practical set, and then when we go to the wide shot, it's the model. And we had them build the model, the actual, what we saw in the tighter shot, they duplicated that from the model. And then right near there, just steps away, was these sort of old abandoned buildings that we turned into the marketplace. If you remember in the early scene where Zuzu and Elvira are about the innkeeper wants money and they jump out the window and they run away down this little market street, and we just created that in a little building, a little road right over next to this church, and brought in some extras and vegetables and stuff and sausage like Zuzu grabs, and we get there and it's all so beautifully done. And then the production designer said, "Oh yes, and just give us another minute because I have one little surprise for you." And this truck pulls up, and he has a whole flock of geese that he wants to just put on this little street as like extra set dressing. And I'm like, this looks like Richard Lester's Three Musketeers or something. It looks incredible. Well, the one thing we hadn't counted on is that the actress playing Zuzu was allergic to fowl.
Oops.
So the scene where they push her out the window, we pick it up where she's already splatted on the ground, face down, and these geese are going by her, and she said, just do it, just have them go by me, but just make it quick. And she gets, but it was incredible. I mean, just little details like that were so unexpected for me, and yet so rich and wonderful. Well, last year, May of last year, Cassandra and I took a tour group of 30 super fans of Elvira's Haunted Hills to Romania for a 9-day tour. And we went to the studio where we had shot it. And of course, all the sets are long gone. They've been torn down because there's a sound stage and they've got to make room for the next tenant to come in and build the next movie. But I wanted to show everyone the studio, and luckily, Tim Burton's Wednesday had all of the sets that they were using at the studio. That's where they shot. That's where they were shooting it. And so we got to see all these great, amazing Tim Burton sets. And then, but then we got on a tour bus and started to go to these different locations where we had shot exteriors. And we went to that church. It had, this is 25 years ago. It had not changed at all. It was exactly the way it was. We walked over to the little building where we set up the market. It was like just a time warp. It was exactly the way it was. And the people on the tour just absolutely flipped over it. Then went to this other studio where I had done Oblivion, where we had, when I got there, it was a cornfield, and we tore down the cornfield and built this western town just out on the outskirts of Bucharest. in between Bucharest and Transylvania. And we built the most incredible Western town for this thing. Again, cheap labor. Well, that is still there. And an entire movie studio grew up around it. And it's the centerpiece of their back lot of sets. And they have like 10 state-of-the-art giant sound stages and everything. And that Western town has been used in so many movies, including like the Hatfields and the McCoys. The Kevin Costner series was shot on that street, and everything. Well, I just cried to see that again. It was exactly as we had left it there, and it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. And the people that run the studio are the people that own that cornfield, and they got into the movie business, and you know, it was incredible. And they're still there, and we were crying, this big reunion. And then this I think of him as this kid who was like a production assistant on Oblivion is now like their second in command executive running the studio, and it was amazing. It was just such a great reunion. But yeah, we had a great time with that. Anyway, yeah, as you can see, you wind me up, I can't stop.
I know this is the director's tales, but I want to ask about a project you produced.
Okay.
One of my all-time favorite films that had a huge impact on me, called Gods and Monsters.
Yes.
Oh my God. How did you get into
Walker just gave me a painting that he did of Brendan Fraser for
Nice,
the film.
nice.
So
What an
incredible.
amazing film, but how did you get involved in that, Sam?
Well, even though it sounds like Pit and the Pendulum is my favorite film of all time, my real favorite film of all time, Pit and the Pendulum is probably second or third.
So you know something about Pit and Pendulum?
Yeah, maybe. Is Bride of Frankenstein, which I also saw around the age of 5 on TV, on Shock Theater on Saturday afternoon, right after Dick Clark's American Bandstand.
Yep. That's when all the monster movie mandates came out.
Exactly, and that movie spoke to me in profound ways that I didn't fully grasp until I was much older. But you know how the Frankenstein films, several of them, have little innocent kids. Like in the first Frankenstein, the little girl who's putting flowers in the water, the little boy in Son of Frankenstein, and there's even a couple. There's a little girl in Ghost of Frankenstein. The thing that's constant with all of those kids is that they're not afraid of the monster. Through their innocent eyes, he is. They haven't been taught by society to be prejudiced or whatever. And that's the way I was at 5. I was not afraid of Boris Karloff as the creature. I pitied him. I thought that the Dr. Frankenstein was the villain for abandoning the creature. And when I saw Bride of Frankenstein, I just remember bawling and crying so hard when he befriended, all he wanted was a friend. And he goes into the woods and meets the blind hermit with the violin and everything. And he develops a friendship. And the reason he develops it is because the blind hermit, it doesn't see that he's ugly and is able to see him as a human being. And I found that so touching as an innocent child. Through an innocent child's eyes, I was really moved by that. And then when the two woodsmen come in, and one of them's John Kerry.
I was going to damn you, John Kerry.
And they misconstrue the whole situation, and of course through their adult prejudiced eyes, all they see is this ugly monster, and they think that he's going to kill the blind guy or whatever, and then it turns into where the monster has to defend himself from being killed by these guys, and he kills them, and so every time the monster killed, in most cases, it was self-defense or being misunderstood. So it's and somehow I identified with that whole outsider thing, where I identified with him as a freak of nature who was misunderstood by society, and as I got older and was a closeted gay kid who felt like a freak of nature who was misunderstood by society, I absolutely identified with the monster. And as the later films, they weren't always as intelligently done. It got to the point where the monster was many times just kind of a lug, but in those early films, they really, James Whale, the director of the first two, really put his heart and soul into
absolutely.
it. And he was gay, and many of the collaborators he was working with were gay, and I just know that they were injecting their own life experience into the subtext of everything that was going on. And somehow, even as early as the age of 5, that was speaking to me in really profound ways, and it just became more pronounced as I got older and understood what it was that I was identifying with. Well, then in the 90s, I read a book by Christopher Brand called Father of Frankenstein. And it was all about James Whale's later life after he had retired from directing, and he was he'd become a painter, and this beautiful story where he wants to paint his hunky gardener, who's a straight character, and the gardener agrees to, and they develop the conversations that they have when he's doing the sittings and everything. They develop this really wonderful relationship and realize that they have way more in common than they ever thought they would. And I thought it was such a beautiful, touching story. But there was also a flashback of James Whale directing Bride of Frankenstein, and that appealed to me for obvious reasons. And there was just everything about that book spoke to me. And I got in touch with the author, and I said, I have no money, but is there any way you would give me an option on the book, free option, to let me try to see if I can get it set up somewhere? And he said, well, I would have considered that, except that a guy named Bill Condon just beat you to it a couple of weeks ago. And I said, oh my God, I know Bill Condon. I've met him at Nancy Allen's parties, because I had become, when I worked for De Palma, I became very close friends with Nancy Allen. And so I called Nancy to get Bill's number, and I called him up, and I said, congratulations on the book. And I said, thank you. It's going to be a while, because I have to write the script, and I have to then try to package it, and try to get actors attached, and try to get money. So it's not going to happen tomorrow. And I said, well, look, if there's anything I can do to help, I would love to be a part of it. And he said, well, let me get the script done and see what happens. And I'm, typical brush off. So, so anyway, then I said, have you thought of Ian McKellen to play James Whale? And he says, oh my God, I can't believe you said that. I just sent a copy of the book to Ian McKellen, and I'm hoping that he's going to respond favorably and want to do it. And I said, wow, well, I can't believe we're on the same wavelength for that, but that's great. So I wish you the best of luck. So about a year later, I'm at this production company, Region Entertainment, and I've been doing various films for them. In fact, the head of the company had been at a couple of companies, but he was head of the company that I did my first film for, Guilty as Charged. And I heard him out in the hallway. I was sitting in a little office, heard him out in the hallway mention Father of Frankenstein. And I jumped up from my chair, went out there, what are you talking about? And he goes, oh, well, this guy named Bill Condon has submitted a script. He's got an Ian McKellen attached, and he's looking for money. He's looking for a production company that will want to take it on. And I said, Paul, you're doing this movie, and I'm going to be one of the producers. And I just kept badgering until they finally said yes. And so that's how I became involved, where I just inserted myself, whether anyone liked it or not.
Nice.
And then when we did that flashback of the Bride of Frankenstein scene, I insisted that we built a replica, as much as we could afford, of the Bride of the Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein laboratory, and we found the original electrical equipment.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
That Kenneth
The actual
Strickfaden
stuff
had
from the
made
30s, yeah.
for the Frankenstein,
Yeah.
Bride of Frankenstein. Then Mel Brooks had used it
Yep,
for
Young
Young
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein. And ironically enough, a B movie from the late 60s called Dracula versus Frankenstein
Yes.
also used it. And Sandor Vorkov, who played Dracula, is sitting at the table next to me in the room over here at this convention. And I've talked to him about that equipment. It's just so weird how these things intersect.
That's a story in itself, the trail, that
Yeah.
equipment.
Yeah, and I don't know of any other films that it's been in, but it's just, it's just weird how
A
it's
couple of
still around.
little old, low-budget horror films that somehow got access to some of it.
Yeah, very probably. And Kenneth Strickfaden did electrical equipment at
And
other
it was also
studios.
used in the Flash Gordon serials.
Yeah, the Flash Gordon serials and some of the Frankenstein sets, the
Yes.
staircase and
That's
stuff. But also Kenneth Strickfaden did the electrical equipment in Mask of Fu Manchu with Karloff that was made at MGM, and that had a lot of electrical equipment in it, and I bet some of it,
Oh, it's very recognizable.
yeah.
To any of us that grew up with
Yeah,
that
I'm sure
stuff.
some of it made its way into that film too. And ironically, a film that I also love, another Frankenstein film called Frankenstein: The True Story, that I'm obsessed with, as some of you may know. That movie was produced by Hunt Stronger Jr., and his dad produced Mask of Fu Manchu. And young Hunt, when he was on the sets and he got to know Karloff and was a big monster kid back in the day, like all of us, and it all resulted in Frankenstein: The True Story eventually. And Hunt Stronger Jr. is also gay. I really identify with him and have written, a whole book on the movie. And oh Lord, don't get me started on that. We'll never get out of here. But Hunt Jr., he discovered Vampira and created her show in the 1950s, and he's really responsible for horror hosts. So, it's interesting how all this stuff sort of intersects.
Anything you want to talk about, Guilty as Charged? I promised you I'd come back to it. So.
Yes, what was I going to? Oh, yes, this goes back to. Wait, I've told this story so many times. I hope I didn't. Did I tell you? I did tell you. I already did.
Okay. Just want to make sure you covered it. Yes.
The review.
The review,
it to
yeah.
Pulitzer
You told me
Prize
that's
and all
right,
that
because I
kind of-
wanted to make sure we did pass that.
We did circle back to it. Good.
We'll give someone a chance to ask. I think we're probably over time, but I don't care. Ask your questions, folks.
I had a quick question. It's not really about directing, but all your interviews you did on audio, did you save those and maybe digitize those?
The audio tapes got destroyed in a flood, and my mom threw them out. They might have been able to be saved, but I was living in New York, and she threw them out before I even knew what was going on. And but of those 35 interviews that I did, I collected them into my book. I Was a Teenage Monster Hunter: How I Met Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing Moore, which is on sale at our table. What I did was, it's also available in audiobook. So I got anyone who's still alive, I got them to come back and re-record their answers. And I got Jane Seymour, Stephanie Beacham, Linda Hayden, Madeline Smith, Chloe Franks. They all came back and recorded their answers. I do the questions and I narrate the rest of the book. And then the ones who passed away, like Diana Rigg, I got Juliette Mills to come in and record her answers. And they were friends. They even did a play together on the West End back in the 60s. And then Juliette Mills' husband in real life is Maxwell Caulfield. And I got him to do Ralph Bates and Shane Bryant. I got Alex Hyde-White, who's an actor, who's done some Marvel movies and stuff. But his dad was a really famous character actor, Wilfred Hyde-White, who was in My Fair Lady and, did all kinds of big movies. But anyway, the son, Alex, had worked with Peter Cushing in one of Peter's very last movies called Biggles something or other.
Yeah.
Forget, some kind of sort of adventure film.
Adventures in Time.
There you go.
Yeah.
Biggles,
Yeah.
Adventures in Time. And very gold star. And so he said, could I do Peter Cushing? Because we became friends on that. So there's a lot of really cool voices, guest stars. Oh, Olivia Dabo, who from Wonder Years, and she was the girl in Conan the Destroyer with Schwarzenegger and stuff. She said, could I do Ingrid Pitt?
Oh, nice.
And she's a big fan of Ingrid Pitt, so she does that one. It's really great. And Elvira or Cassandra Peterson does the foreword. She wrote the foreword, so she voices her own foreword. So the audiobook, even though I didn't have any of those tapes, we kind of did the next best thing.
It's an audible.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's on and on Amazon. You just look up the book, and
Yeah.
it'll give you all the formats, and you can click on Audible. But you have to have the print edition because it has hundreds of photos, so you need them both to get the full experience.
Anybody else have
any other questions?
How did you get to work with Brian De Palma? How did that?
So, my magazine Bazaar was going strong, and I was interviewing all these great people. I even it was so successful, I got my parents to send me back to London the second year. I was there in 74 and 75, and it was all going strong, and I did one issue a year, and I sort of put it all together in the summer during my summer break from school. And so I did from 72 to 75, I had 4 issues of Bazaar. I even found the 4th issue of one of our vendors here.
Oh, nice.
And so in 75, I was starting my freshman year in college, and things were getting really busy. I was trying to figure out, I always wanted to be a director, and I was trying to figure out, could I immigrate to London and work for Hammer Films? Well, Hammer Films at that time in 75 were really hanging on by a thread, and things were really rough. Amicus Productions had fallen apart. The 2 producers, Milton Spotsky and Rosenberg, and they had broken up, and I just got the sense that it was a dying industry there, especially in that genre. And then I saw Phantom of the Paradise and Sisters, those two great early De Palma films that blew me away. And this just became my new passion. And I thought if I was going to try to hitch my wagon to something, to try to do it in England was just not going to happen. And here's this great young director on the rise in America, and I wanted to meet him. So I was in my freshman year of college at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina. And my dad also owned movie theaters there as well. But I had already, a freshman in college, and a month after I'm there, I got elected chairman of the student union cinematic arts committee that ran the movie theater on campus. And we had a budget, and we showed free films during the week, and those were mainly sort of art house movies and foreign films and all that. But on the weekends, we'd show a little bit more commercial movies and charge very small admission. I think it was $1 or $2, but we made enough from that to finance the free movies and have a surplus to put on special events. And so the first special event I organized was a Brian De Palma Film Festival. And we got Phantom of the Paradise, Sisters, and Greetings and Hi Mom, which were even earlier films of his that introduced Robert De Niro to the world.
That was his first one.
And I, figured I've got to get in touch with him. I knew he lived in New York, but then I found in my father's Hollywood Reporter under the production charts that a film called Carrie was in early stages of pre-production, and they listed a phone number for the casting office in Los Angeles. So I cold called that number, and they put him right on.
Nice.
And I explained what I was doing, and he said, "No one's ever done a film festival or my stuff. This sounds great. Yeah, I'd love to come." So I brought him out to South Carolina and took him to my film class, and he's in the chalkboard drawing storyboards, and he had brought, oh my God, my sister just walked in. Hey!
Brother, just finish up.
Okay.
I don't want to interrupt you.
Okay. So anyway, he brought a cassette tape and a little player, and was playing his cues from a movie that he was in post-production on at the moment called Obsession. Actually, at the time it was called Deja Vu, but when it got released many months later, it didn't get picked up by Columbia Pictures for a while, and didn't come out for almost maybe 9 or 10 months. But he started playing his music cues that had just been recorded for it, that had been composed by Bernard Herrmann, the great composer of Citizen Kane and Psycho and everything. And Bernard Herrmann had also done the score for his film Sisters, which was fantastic. So he was just premiering, the first ears to ever hear this beyond, the people actually working on it, these incredible cues of Bernard Herrmann's score. And this was in November of 1975. And he said, oh, and Bernie is going to be doing the score for Carrie too. And he said, in fact, right now, I recommended him to my friend Marty, as in Marty Scorsese. And he's right now doing the score to Taxi Driver. And we were all very impressed and everything. Well, for those who may not know, Bernard Herrmann did finish recording the score the very next month in December, and after the last recording session, went back to his hotel and died of a heart attack. And that's why Bernard Herrmann did not end up doing the score for Carrie. But at the time I met De Palma, that was the intent. So, anyway, we showed, I could tell you all sorts of stuff, but it's just, well, I'll tell you one quick thing.
Okay.
When we showed Phantom of the Paradise, we did it as a midnight show. We asked people to come in cosplay, costumes, or anything, and we'd have Brian De Palma to judge the best and give away prizes. And so it was completely sold out, 300-seat theater, and we, judge the costumes, and everybody's all pumped and everything, and then we finally get ready to show the film. It's probably about 12:30 in the morning now, and it comes on the screen. If you're familiar with the movie, it's that rotating dead bird that starts to rotate of Swan Song Records or whatever it was, Death Records.
Yeah.
And there's no sound. And I go racing up to the projection booth. It was a 16 millimeter print. And if you're unfamiliar with it, on celluloid film, there's the picture, and then there's a little squiggly line that's the sound. Well, you have to have a separate little bulb in the projector that shines through that squiggly line that creates the sound track. And that bulb had burned out. Now, any professional projectionist to make sure that they have lots of spare bulbs, but somehow there were no spare bulbs.
Oh, no.
And it's 12:30 at night, and Columbia, South Carolina, and you're not going to be able to go to the corner 7-Eleven and find a specialized bulb that's going to fit your 60 millimeter projector, so we had to cancel the show and refund all the money. And I thought, oh my God, all of the goodwill that I have built up and everything that I did to impress Brian De Palma up to this point has just been flushed down the drain. I'm toast. But this will explain Brian De Palma's dark sense of humor. He thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened. And I ended up obviously I became his assistant a little bit later, and I'll explain that in a second, but he always, whenever he introduced me to anybody, he loved to tell that story to embarrass me, including Steven Spielberg, who came to visit his office at one point, his editing room, and he regaled Steven with that story, and I'm just like, oh my God. But that's the way Brian was. He loved, and it made me memorable in an odd way. If it had all gone perfectly, might not have.
Yep.
I don't know. It's just weird how things work out. But anyway, what happened was after that, I went back to school. He went back to make Carrie, and Carrie became his first really big breakthrough hit. And Obsession came out literally the month before Carrie, and it was a kind of 1-2 punch. Obsession came out, got rave reviews, did pretty well at the box office for Columbia Pictures. And then the month later, Carrie just blows up like crazy for United Artists and got great reviews, got nominated for Oscars, especially, it doesn't happen that often for horror films, especially back then. And Sissy Spacek was up for Best Actress, and Piper Laurie for Supporting Actress, and it was his breakthrough. His buddies, Steven Spielberg had Jaws as his breakthrough, George Lucas had Star Wars, Coppola had The Godfather. This, Carrie, was Brian's big moment. And I just wish that I had somehow, had the nerve to ask him if I could work on it, because I think he might have said yes. And it's my favorite De Palma film to this day. But after he became that big, then I was like even more determined to hitch my wagon to him. And so the following summer of '77, he was going to be doing his next film, The Fury, which was a much bigger budgeted film for 20th Century Fox. It was going to be telekinesis again, like it was in Carrie, but it was going to have this huge all-star cast with Kirk Douglas, John Cassavetes, and all these people. And so I now had his home number. I called him up and said, could I please come up to Chicago where you're going to be shooting this and work on it during my summer break? And he said yes. So,
Nice.
so I went up there and worked as his assistant. I also got put in there as an extra in the amusement park scene where Andrew Stevens goes through with his telekinesis making all the rides go crazy. And I also got an assignment from Cinefantastique magazine, because by now I was too busy with college and too busy pursuing Brian De Palma to be doing my fanzine in the summer months, because I was working on this movie. So, and I knew the editor of Cinefantastique, and I called up Fred Clark and said, could I do a journal on the making of the film for the magazine? And they'd already done a cover issue on Carrie, and he said, yes, it'd be great. And so that allowed me to be way more than just an assistant. I could actually request one-on-one interviews with Kirk Douglas and everybody involved. And so I wrote up this great thing for Cinefantastique. But then, things kind of got weird. And Star Wars came out, and Cinefantastique delayed the issue on The Fury because they wanted to do a double issue on Star Wars, and Fred Clark, the editor, flipped over Star Wars. And then The Fury opened, and the editor hated it. He hated it. And he canceled the cover, and he cut my whole article in half and edited and chopped it up. And so now I really think I've burned my bridges with De Palma, because I had promised him that it was going to be a cover story. He liked the Carrie thing. He loved the Carrie issue and everything. But, he was not real happy about it. But he said, Sam, you know, it wasn't your fault, and you know, it just is what it is. But and the movie honestly didn't get the greatest reviews at the time, and wasn't as huge a hit as 20th Century Fox was hoping it would be. And so, you know, this wasn't the only disappointment that De Palma had to face on that. But I went back to school thinking I'd never hear from him again. And I did my senior year in college. And in May, right around the time I was doing my last exams, I get a call from De Palma. And he goes, I've been teaching a course this semester on screenwriting at Sarah Lawrence College. And the students, I had a treatment for a comedy called Home Movies that had been sitting in the drawer, and I pulled that out, and we had all the students divide up the scenes and write scenes, and we've spent the whole semester honing it into a script. And now I think it's pretty good, and I'm going to direct it as a low-budget film this summer. Do you want to come up and work on it? And I was like, yeah. So I finished my last exam, got on the next plane, did not even go to my graduation ceremony, went right up to New York, and he had been teaching the course at Sarah Lawrence College, so they were going to shoot it in and around the campus and put up. He was going to use his students as some of the crew, and he pulled me in, and then they were fleshing it out with other professional crew members, and they had gotten Kirk Douglas to agree to be in it, and Nancy Allen to be in it, and Keith Gordon, and Garrett Graham, who played Beef in Phantom of the Paradise. It was a really cool cast. And I just thought, oh, I'm going to be his assistant again, and I'm not going to approach anybody to write an article because we know how that went.
Yeah.
And he said, no, Sam, you're going to be the associate producer and production manager.
Nice.
And that's what happened. And we shot it that summer. And as soon as we finished shooting, you know, I think he just basically threw me into the deep end to see if I could swim. And at the end of the summer, he invited me to, or asked me if I would be his full-time assistant and sort of, you know, head of his one-man development company, which would be him and me as the reader, you know, would write readers' reports on scripts or, you know, whatever. And so I moved to New York and became his assistant on Dress to Kill and worked on a lot of other projects. Some didn't happen. We worked about a year on Prince of the City and developed a whole script by David Ray. But that film ended up being directed by Sidney Lumet and with Treat Williams. Brian had gotten Robert De Niro to agree to star in it, but De Niro was, you know, now an Oscar winner and a huge star, and had 2 or 3 other movies that he had to do beforehand, and the studio wasn't willing to wait. And De Palma said, "No, you don't turn down De Niro. We're waiting." And he said, "Why don't we do this script called Dress to Kill in the meantime?" And they said no. And so the next thing he knew, Sidney Lumet had been hired by the studio, and he found out about it by reading it in the paper. And it turned out that Sidney Lumet's agent was Sue Mengers, very, very well-known, huge Hollywood agent. She was also Brian De Palma's agent up until that moment, until he had me get her on the phone where he very loudly fired her. But it was great working with him. I worked on the prep and development of Blowout for about a year. And then just around the time we were going to start shooting Blowout, Brian wanted me to produce this low-budget comedy called The First Time that Brian was going to be executive producing. And it was one of his students from Sarah Lawrence College who was going to be directing it, and he had written it. And his family had money, and they put up about $250,000. And Brian, you know, we had done a budget for $500,000, and Brian said, "Sam, you need to go out and raise the other $250 and produce this while I'm dealing with Blowout." And so that's what I ended up doing. And I went to New Line Cinema and had a meeting with Bob Shea, and he said, "Sure, I'll put the money in." It was a slam dunk.
Nice.
which never happens in the business, never, ever, and it never happened to me again. That was the only money I ever successfully raised on a project, ever. And, but anyway, once I had done that, I couldn't really go back to making coffee for Brian De Palma as his assistant. So, and he understood that. And so a really close friend of mine took over my job as his assistant, and I went on to, I did a short film, and eventually I had to pay off the short film because I paid it with credit cards. I had to do a regular job in film marketing for a few years, but eventually got my first feature.
Well, folks, I hate that we have to stop it there, because there's a whole lot more we can talk about. So we're going to bring it back again, Sam, for part 2 at another Monsterama. But folks, Mr. Sam Irvin, and I could sit here all night listening to these guys. Thank you.